theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View.
Let me first of all thank Representative Louis Gohmert for sitting in for me yesterday. I was speaking in a church in Oregon, and not only did they want me to speak in the morning, Sunday morning, but also Sunday night, and it just made it difficult to even think about trying to get back on time. So I really appreciate him coming in here and actually putting together an outstanding program. So Louis Gohmert, thank you for sitting in for me. Look forward to the next opportunity. We're in studio face to face. This is our Thanksgiving week, and I do want to mention that tomorrow we are going to talk a little bit about Thanksgiving and provide some history. And yes, I'm going to dress up like I sometimes do as a pilgrim, so you'll be able to watch that if you'd like as well. Could be opportunity for us to learn a little bit about America's godly heritage, learn a little bit about Thanksgiving, about the pilgrims, and most importantly, you might want to get some of your kids to gather around and to listen to that program as well. Today we have a number of topics that we will be getting into in the next 2 hours, but the first hour, as I mentioned, will be on theistic evolution. There is this new book out which is a critique of theistic evolution, and that's something to think about, because whether you go off to a secular university or even a lot of the Christian universities, the answer usually is given, well, if you believe there's God, fine, then God used evolution, and that's how we explain both the Bible and science. And there are some really big concerns about this. So there is this new book out entitled Theistic Evolution, a Scientific, Philosophical, and Theological Critique. It is edited by a number of individuals that have been on this program, like J.P. Moreland. Dr. Steve Meyer will be with us in just a minute, Wayne Grudem, to mention a few. So I would certainly commend the book to you and encourage you to find out a little bit more. And it's also to sit back, listen for a few minutes, and then if you'd like to ask some questions or make some comments, we would love to hear from you. Dr. Stephen Meyer has been on the program with us many times before. I've known him literally for decades. His wife actually taught my oldest daughter in school, and that was before he headed off to Cambridge, where he received his Ph.D. He is an individual that is taught at Whitworth University and is, of course, best known as an individual that directs Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture in Seattle. You think about all the different books we've talked about with him over the years, but some that come to mind are The Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design, as well as Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. And then, of course, he is the editor, the co-editor, if you will, of this book on theistic evolution. Dr. Stephen Meyer, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, it's great to be back with you, and we do go way back.
Well, we certainly do, and certainly spoken at various events and things of that nature. And since one of your chapters, interestingly enough, is really on how to define theistic evolution, let's start there, because not only do we need to have a proper definition before we do a critique, but we really need to understand kind of what we're talking about here. So how would you kind of define theistic evolution?
Well, the difficulty in defining it derives from the fact that there are multiple different definitions of evolution. So that's where we start in the book. There's the first definition of evolution is the kind of trivial one, just the idea of change over time. And nobody really disputes that. We can all agree that the life today is different than life that we see in the fossil record, and that there are small-scale variations like the Galapagos finch beaks getting bigger and smaller, and peppered moths going dark and light and dark again. That kind of microevolutionary variation is not in dispute. The second meaning of the term is the idea of universal common ancestry, that all forms of life that we see on Earth today are related by some kind of process of descent with modification, such that the forms of life that we see today ultimately evolved or derived from some one or very few simple forms of life at the beginning. So that's the tree of life picture of the history of life idea, where the branches at the top are modern forms and the trunk at the bottom is that one primeval ancestor of us all, according to the theory. And then the third meaning of evolution is it refers to the cause or the process by which that pattern of change emerged. And that is typically in modern Darwinism thought to be the mechanism of natural selection acting on random mutations. That would be the mechanism or the cause that allegedly generates all new forms of life, and also the appearance of design that biologists universally recognize in life. The Darwinists, of course, say that appearance is an illusion because it was produced by an unguided, undirected process, namely natural selection acting on random variation. So the version of theistic evolution that we're principally concerned to critique is the third, is the idea of God somehow conjoined with that third meaning of evolution. But the book also does provide some significant critique of evolution number 2, the idea of universal common ancestry.
Well, it certainly does. Now, again, one of the reasons you do this is because there are some very prominent individuals who are Christians, and I don't deny their Christian convictions, even though I may disagree with some of their application, but they have tried to make the case that this whole debate that has developed, and whether you're talking about young Earth creationists like the Institute for Creation Research, Answers in Genesis, or old Earth creationists like Reasons to Believe, or whatever that particular group is, or even those you guys in the area of intelligent design, this isn't really that important because really, God exists. We believe in a sovereign God, and so God gave us an evolutionary process that we have seen in science. So there's really no conflict, and no need to even try to resolve what would be potentially apparent conflict between science and religion. And yet, in one of the chapters, Wayne Grudem, and I would imagine you would be able to articulate this as well, talks about what he calls the incompatibility of theistic evolution with a biblical account of creation. And I know that's one of the reasons why you have written the book, isn't it?
Well, right. For me, from my point of view, as someone who's been immersed in the science and who is also a Christian, I'm concerned that many theologians and pastors who have been pressed by the point of view of the theistic evolutionists, or the evolutionary creationists, as they're now calling themselves,
right,
feel that somehow they're under an obligation, an intellectual obligation, to accept an evolutionary point of view and then interpret the scripture or Christian doctrines through the lens of that evolutionary hermeneutic, is the term of art. I think scientifically that's completely unnecessary, and in fact it's in a way just the opposite. In my previous book, Darwin's Doubt, I argued that there has never been there's an unusual disparity between the public presentation of the status of evolutionary theory by science popularizers, by textbook writers, by pronouncements from official science organizations on the one hand, and the actual status of the theory as you find it in the peer-reviewed literature in the field of evolutionary biology. Leading evolutionary biologists are calling for a new theory of evolution. They're exploring the need for new mechanisms because they know that the mutation natural selection mechanism has very little, if any, creative power. Many of them are saying things like, natural selection and random mutation explains the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. It explains small-scale adaptations, but not the origin of, say, birds and mammals and animals in the first place.
Let's take a break. I want to come back into that a little bit more because we got one of those mandatory breaks. But again, there are two arguments you can make today. First of all, actually accepting evolution from a scientific point of view is unnecessary. Accepting it theologically is incompatible. We'll talk about that with Stephen Meyer right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Many of the best-selling books over the last decade have been written by the New Atheist. Although you may never meet any of these authors, you will certainly interact with skeptics who use their arguments. One of the best Christian books to help refute many of the arguments by these new atheists is the book Is God Just a Human Invention, written by Sean McDowell and Jonathan Morrow. They answer 18 of the most cited arguments used by the new atheists against religion, and especially against Christianity. One of those arguments is found in the title of the book, that God is merely a human invention. Sigmund Freud wrote that religious beliefs are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind. In other words, we project the existence of God based upon a human need. It is wish fulfillment. We wish there would be a God, so we assume that he exists. As McDowell and Murrow point out in their book, there are many good reasons to reject this idea. One objection is that Freud's argument begs the question. In other words, he assumes there is no God and then merely tries to find an explanation for why someone would believe in God anyway. The projection theory can cut both ways. If you argue that humans created God out of a need for security, then you could just as easily argue that atheists believe there is no God because they want to be free and unencumbered by a creator who might make moral demands on them. It's not surprising to read how many prominent atheists in the past have acknowledged just that. They wanted their sexual freedom and found that required that they reject the idea of God. Paul teaches in the book of Romans that fallen individuals suppress the truth in unrighteousness. The Bible also has a good explanation for why most people believe in God. The writer of Ecclesiastes observes that God has set eternity in the hearts of men. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, the first Christmas through a whole new set of eyes. The Star, now playing rated PG, thestarmovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. Stephen Meyer, and if you'd like to join our conversation, we'll open up the phones in just a few minutes, 1-800-351-1212. And again, the argument we're making here, and I will probably spend time in a future program getting more into some of the theological issues, but if you, for example, say, well, it's not all that important that we believe in a historic Adam or Eve, or a Noah, or a Jonah, or anybody like that. Well, Jesus did. You know, when he talks about marriage and divorce, he says, "Have you not read?" And takes you back to Adam and Eve. When he talks about Jonah being in the belly of the fish for 3 days, when he talks about Noah as it was in the days of Noah. So there are some real important theological reasons. And one of the talks we've done here before here on Point of View, and we can do it again, is why we believe in creation. And whether you look at Jesus or whether you look at the quotations of the Apostle Paul or a variety of others, certainly that is the case. But because we have Stephen Meyer with us, I wanted to focus on, as he was explaining, there are a lot of people that are saying, well, we just have to accept that the theory of evolution is true, so that must be the way God used it. And Stephen, just a minute ago, you were talking about this issue, and the chapter 3, written by someone that is actually an expert in this field, calls it Evolution, a Story Without a Mechanism. Now, if we open up a typical high school biology textbook, it says that we have mutations. Most are deleterious, but there are a few that are good, and if we add up enough mutations, natural selection will give us new species, and we will create every form of life in this tree of life. But even hardened secular evolution scientists are really having doubts about whether or not they found a mechanism for evolution, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. In the preceding chapter in the new book and in my book, Darwin's Doubt, I actually go through 4 different fundamental challenges to the creative power of mutation and selection. One is fairly easy to understand just by reference to our own experience of the computer world. Since Watson and Crick, we've known that DNA contains information in an essentially digital or typographic form. There are subunits along the spine of the DNA molecule that are functioning like letters in an alphabetic text, or the zeros and ones in a section of software. If you start randomly changing the zeros and ones in a section of software, you're going to introduce bugs and glitches, and you're going to destroy or efface the existing function long before you get to a new program or operating system. And a similar problem affects the mutation selection mechanism. That the mutations, there's so many more ways to go wrong than there are to go right. So few correct ways of arranging the digital characters in DNA that will give you a functional protein, compared to all the ways that will give you something that will destroy function, means that mathematically you're overwhelmingly more likely to degrade and destroy function before you ever get to a new protein that is capable of new functions. And so that's one problem. Another problem is that not all mutations are the same. If you want to build a new animal, you've got to mutate the developing organism early in the process of development from embryo to adult. If the mutations don't occur early, they can't affect all the other cells that emerge from that process downstream. But those mutations that occur early are also the ones that are always deleterious, that are always destructive and shut down animal development. So it's a kind of a catch-22. The kinds of mutations you need, you don't get. The kind you get, you don't need. And so there are many really formidable problems like this that are causing leading scientists to doubt that the mutation selection mechanism is creative. And yet you have the theistic evolutionists telling us that that's the mechanism by which God created. They attribute the mutation, or they attribute to God the use of that mutation selection process as his means of creating. And yet the process scientifically, for very good reasons, I think is now understood to lack creativity.
You know, when you get into the whole history of science, we've had Dr. Paul Nelson on this program, for example. You know him. And I love what he says. Let's give Charles Darwin his due. He came up with this idea of natural selection, and that was pretty good. But he knew very little, if anything, in the 19th century about what we call molecular biology. And as we've also talked about with people like Michael Behe, in a sense, the whole cell was like a black box. And so that's why he called the book Darwin's Black Box. When you look at a cell, even an amoeba or protoplasm or whatever it is, you are obviously looking through a light microscope. But now the electron microscope tells us that, as you pointed out a minute ago, the DNA is very complex, but these structures that are even these microstructures in the cell are much more complex and difficult to explain on the basis of evolution. True?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, yeah, you have the nano machines, which are just absolutely fascinating. And Behe, of course, has written persuasively about why those are difficult to explain by the mutation selection mechanism. My focus has been on the information encoded in DNA, which is necessary to build those machines and even the protein parts out of which they're made. And this is, I think, just a stop-press moment in the history of biology in the 1950s and 60s when
Yes.
scientists realized that at the foundation of life, we have instructions, we have a code, we have information stored in a molecule. And everything we know from experience is that information always arises from an intelligent source, whether we're looking at the information in a software program or a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book. So we have we have in our experience a connection that we know between intelligence and the generation of information, and we find at the foundation of life we have information suggesting that there was an intelligence that played a role in the origin of life. And that's one of the things that the theistic evolutionists deny. They want to endorse the adequacy of the completely naturalistic process of mutation and selection, or maybe some other newer evolutionary mechanisms, but and then say somehow God was involved in that without saying that he in any way directed or guided it. So it's really never clear exactly what God is doing in the process. Essentially, it's the same old materialistic evolutionary theory with a kind of theistic rhetorical gloss, but no real substance in the sense of being able to specify what, if anything, God might have done had to do with the process of creation.
One other question that certainly is surfacing in the area of evolution, and this was the subject of your book, Darwin's Doubt. Darwin had a real problem with the fact that when you look at the oldest rocks, the so-called Precambrian rocks, that you don't see a lot, and all of a sudden then in the Cambrian you see everything. And so in a sense, some people have called it evolution's Big Bang. But when we talk about the origin of life, when we talk about the explosion of life in the fossil record, that's, again, not what Charles Darwin would have predicted, is it?
Not at all. And interestingly, just to underscore the point I was just making, a year ago, a number of us attended the Royal Society conference in London, the Royal Society being the oldest and most august scientific body in the world. The conference was called to evaluate the current status of evolutionary theory, with a particular emphasis on a critical evaluation of the still textbook orthodoxy called neo-Darwinism, the modern version of Darwin's theory. And many of the evolutionary biologists there were very dissatisfied with the theory and were calling for new theories, as I've mentioned. The first talk was given by a leading Austrian evolutionary biologist named Gerd Müller, and he started by enumerating what he called the explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory, one of which was its inability to account for what biologists call morphological innovation, the origin of brand new forms of life. But another closely related to that was the abrupt appearance of those forms at multiple intervals up and down the rock column in the fossil record. So the Cambrian explosion that I wrote about is perhaps the best known and maybe the most dramatic of those abrupt appearance events. But there are many, many others. And in the new book on theistic evolution, the leading German paleontologist, Günter Beckley, and I write an article about the many different fossil explosions that have occurred in the history of life. We counted 17 or 18, I think, and suggest that that's a challenge not only to the creative power of the mutation selection mechanism, but also to the idea of universal common ancestry. The history of life simply doesn't look like a great connected branching tree. It looks more like maybe an orchard of separate trees or kind of a lawn, but yeah, a lot of abrupt appearance in the fossil record.
Gunter Breckley, last week we talked about Wikipedia. Isn't he the one where they pulled his Wikipedia page off because all of a sudden he started being sympathetic towards intelligent design?
Exactly. Poor Dr. Beckley has been erased from Wikipedia. He's a non-person now. He used to be considered a very prominent scientist. He's had species and taxa named for him. He's started major exhibitions at the Stuttgart Museum of Natural History. He was, in fact, the spokesman for the 2009 Darwin anniversary exhibition that they had there. But now that he has embraced intelligent design and is doing work with us, he's no longer a person.
Yes.
Does not warrant a mention on Wikipedia.
Well, again, let me just mention that's chapter 10 in the book, so you can't read about him anymore in Wikipedia. We talked about this last week with Robert Knight, and we were talking about what Robert Knight and others have dealt with in terms of Wikipedia, or what Bill Dembski's dealt with. Well, there's just one more name that we mentioned last week. Let's take a break. By the way, if you'd like to join us, we're talking about theistic evolution. Maybe you have some thoughts. 1-800-351-1212. This is a new book out, Theistic Evolution, a scientific, philosophical, and theological critique.
Changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Our topic is theistic evolution. If you would like to join us, let's open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. Perhaps this is something you've been thinking about as you send your young people off to even Christian colleges. Most of the time, theistic evolution is the way it is taught. It, in some respects, for the universities, just seems easier. We'll just say, well, evolution is true, and that's how God did it, and so we'll teach the evolution in a biology class at a Christian university the same way we would teach it in a secular university. And this is a book that really says, wait a minute, before we just jump on this bandwagon, maybe we need to learn a few things more about some of the problems with the theory of evolution. There are also not only scientific issues, but there are theological issues involved as well. And this is why this 1,000-page book, which has just come out, is certainly a resource for you. You can perhaps find the book in your local bookstore. We also have a link to, of course, the Discovery Institute and Dr. Stephen Meyer, as well as a way in which you can order the book if you'd like to do so. And so if you'd like to join us, some calls coming in. We'll get those in just a minute. 1-800-351-1212. And a minute ago, I mentioned the issue of Wikipedia. If you've been listening to the program, you know about a week ago, I think we were talking with Robert Knight. And the reason was because he's had so much trouble with internet trolls changing the Wikipedia page for the organization he's a part of. And I use some other examples. Bill Dembski, who is a very well-known person in the intelligent design movement over the years, has complained that the things they say about him in Wikipedia are wrong. When he tries to change them, they won't change him. And then I mentioned that there was an individual, Gunter Bexley, who actually had his actual whole Wikipedia page just removed once he actually looked a little bit sympathetic towards intelligent design. And that's the chapter called The Fossil Record and the Universal Common Ancestry. My commentary for about Wikipedia is out next Tuesday. And if you haven't signed up for my commentary, I would encourage you to do so. You can receive that. And, of course, many of the radio stations that carry this program carry that as well. Now, one of the other things that I thought was interesting in the fossil record is you talked about, Dr. Stephen Meyer, the abrupt appearance of these fossils in the fossil record. But there's a second issue that causes evolutionists some concern, and that's what's called stasis. That is, when it appears, it looks like it does now. And oftentimes when I teach my course on creation, I will show them pictures of the first whale in the fossil record, the first bat in the fossil record, the first porpoise in the fossil record, whatever it might be, a horseshoe crab, a shrimp, on and on and on. And that's a real concern as well, because if evolution is true, you'd expect there would be more changes. And yet, oftentimes, when some of these creatures appear for the first time in the fossil record, they look pretty much like the ones we have today.
Yeah, it's a pervasive feature of the fossil record. And when Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge first started to write about or develop their theory of punctuated equilibrium, they talked about two phenomena that occur pervasively in the record. One is the abrupt appearance, and then the other is stasis, so that things appear abruptly and discontinuously without clear connections to earlier ancestral forms that are similar, and then they often persist in the record within very narrow limits of change in form. One example that I discuss in Darwin's Doubt is the comb jellies that have been discovered in southern China at the Qingjiang Formation. You have, they're by the standard dating, 530 million years old, and they look identical to the ones we have in Puget Sound. So it's, this is a pervasive feature. And it actually links back to the earlier point I was making about these mechanisms that limit the amount of biological change. If you have early acting, what are called body plan mutations, the ones you would hope could generate new body plans, given that they tend to be, they are universally deleterious or destructive. So if you get the kinds of mutations that might change an organism radically in its form, those mutations invariably destroy the organism during the process of animal development. You get animal death and therefore no more evolution. So there are actually good mechanistic explanations for stasis, why we don't get more change. And oddly, they have to do with very mutational processes that the Darwinists assert are the engine of creativity, but in fact they seem to be an engine of conservation of form.
Well, and again, whether you have a scientific background or just a sense of intuition, as the joke says, we've never seen an explosion in a print factory give us Webster's unabridged dictionary. We've never seen a tornado through a junkyard leaving a 747 jet. Or back to your illustration, we don't see a glitch in one of the computer programs on our laptop giving us a better form of Microsoft Word or PowerPoint or something like that. We recognize that those glitches don't improve the surface, do not improve the program, do not improve the various kinds of structures that are necessary, that comes from very specific intelligent design. And so whether we're talking about creating a mechanism like an engine or a jet, or whether we're talking about developing a computer program, it's the glitches that are the problem, not the source of new creative information, right?
Exactly. And that's a really powerful, intuitive way to get the idea across. I would also add to that there's a mathematical dimension to that argument that's very rigorous. It turns out that if you're relying on mutation and natural selection, you're essentially relying on a random search for new informational sequences. And just mathematically, there is not enough time available, even assuming evolutionary deep time, billions of years, to have a reasonable chance of generating even one new functional gene or protein in the known history of life on Earth. It sounds like a really radical conclusion, but the math actually supports that. I go into that in one of the chapters in the book.
Certainly.
As
well. One of the questions people always like to ask is human origins. You have a chapter here by Casey Luskin, who I think is a very talented individual that you've worked with as well, on the whole issue of human origins in the fossil record. And there's a twofold issue. Number one, if there's no Adam and Eve, then where does sin come into the world? And that's a real big theological question. And so I've even heard some of these people that believe in theistic evolution say that, well, when Jesus talks about Adam, he's just talking about Adam as a human race. When Paul talks about sin coming into the world through the first Adam, well, Paul was probably just wrong. Well, I think we can see some theological problems with that. But the second issue is what Casey Luskin in the book deals with, and that is, do we have from, say, Australopithecus or Neanderthal a finely graduated human fossil chain that shows that really human beings have just evolved from other kinds of apes? What do we have?
Well, there's a lot of discontinuity there as well. And in fact, he's got a section in his essay called Retroactive Confessions of Ignorance, which is in which he explains that, time and time again, we have these transitional forms presented to the public as reinforcing or validating the standard narrative of a gradual transition from the Australopithecines to the genus Homo. And in fact, time and time again, it turns out that when the rest of the story is told, the scientific story is not nearly as neat and tidy as it's presented to the public. And one example, a very leading paleoanthropologist, Ian Tattersall, has now argued that the Homo habilis, which was long thought to be the key missing link between the Australopithecines and all of the various species of Homo, is essentially an artifact of our classification and was not really even a real creature. So Casey writes a very interesting chapter on this, and it's, I think, well worth taking into account some of these scientific problems. I think the bottom line is there's tremendous grounds for skepticism about the storytelling that goes on around human origins. Let
me just say that we're coming to a break here, so when we come back, I want to talk just briefly, don't want to spend a lot of time on some of the philosophy as well. You and Paul Nelson have written a piece on should theistic evolution depend on methodological naturalism. It's big words for just saying, are you going to just look at the world from a naturalistic perspective rather than from a theistic perspective? But let me just mention for our listeners, just as we're going to a break, we've got a couple of links. First of all, one that will get you to the Discovery Institute. We have one at stephencmeyer.org, so you can find out more about him. and that is available on our website. And then we have information about the book. It is just out, and it is in hardcover, and it is one that I suspect would be one that you'd want to put in the hands of especially your students heading off to college who want to major in biology. They may be biology students, they may be wanting to go into the medical field, but they're going to be confronting some of those issues. And even if they go to Christian schools, I had to at least acknowledge that in a lot of these Christian schools today, instead of saying, well, let's teach about creation, they go, no, we won't do that. We'll just simply say that evolution is true. We believe evolution is true. We will say that's how God did it, and that's enough. This is a book to really challenge some of those ideas. We come back, we'll talk about kind of the philosophy as well, because there's scientific as well as biblical and even philosophical concerns. We'll talk about that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A recent article out of Canada reports that ethicists are recommending that conscience laws be modified for the medical profession. The argument suggests that physicians should not have the right to opt out of providing such services as prescribing contraceptives when a patient requests such services. According to the authors, quote, doctors must put patients' interest ahead of their own integrity. If this leads to feelings of guilt or remorse or them dropping out of the profession, so be it, unquote. That is truly shocking language that we should take note of, especially since, as the article in the National Post points out, every country in the civilized world recognizes at least some form of conscientious objection. Not only do the authors suggest that certain professions should be closed to those whose integrity would require the abandonment of the conscience to practice it, it fails to understand what conscience actually is. The reason we provide protections for the exercise of conscience is because people should not be made by the government to make their conscience optional. As Dr. Robert George of Princeton University has put it, quote, the right of conscience is a right to do what one judges oneself to be under an obligation to do, unquote. We will see whether Canada takes up the proposal by its professors, but south of the border, we must be vigilant that we never permit the government to make optional what our Creator has made obligatory. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dr. Stephen Meyer. Let me just suggest, I'm looking at some of the calls and things that are coming in. We might have an open line in the second hour, and if you want to ask questions about creation, evolution, or have you heard about this, or what about those would probably be more appropriate. I think I'll get to those questions later. I'll be able to probably answer some of those that are, general kinds of questions, but given the fact we only have Dr. Stephen Meyer for a few more minutes, wanted to at least focus on this idea of naturalism. Naturalism is the idea that nature is all that there is. And after Charles Darwin's publishing of The Origin of Species, naturalism really did take off. Up until then, you had deism, because you had even atheists saying, well, maybe there's a God, or there maybe isn't a God, but how do we get the origin of the universe? But after that, this was the idea that nature is all that there is. And in that chapter, Stephen Meyer, you and Paul Nelson spend some time talking about that, because when you talk about theistic evolution, even though it's called theistic, eventually I've noticed the individuals that are prominent people in theistic evolution, they don't look that much different than people that are atheistic evolutionists. What have you found?
Well, right. One of the philosopher of science that writes the foreword to the book, Steve Fuller, says that the theistic evolutionists have outsourced their science to the establishment. Mm-hmm. You used a really good phrase just before the break, the idea that in characterizing the position of theistic evolutionists, they say, well, evolution is how God did it. But it's really important to understand that evolution, or the evolutionary mechanism, the causal process, natural selection and random variation, have always been understood by mainstream biologists to be an explanation for the appearance, but not the reality of design. So Richard Dawkins says that biology is the study of complicated things that appear to be designed for a purpose, where the key word is appearance. Well, why is the design that we look at in living systems only apparent? Well, it's because mutation and natural selection did the job without being guided or directed in any way. So when the theistic evolutionist says that's the mechanism by which God created, it raises a bit of a problem, because this mechanism was understood as the explanation for the appearance of design, but it's only an appearance because the mechanism is unguided. So that raises the question, is God guiding that process, or is it a purely unguided process? And the leading theistic evolutionists in the evangelical world have been loath to answer that question. We've put it to them many times, and we get answers, well, it might be guided, or it could be guided, but we're not sure. And that's really a theory with no content. You know, they're not willing to specify any role for God in the process of creation beyond having created the universe and sustaining the laws of nature. But they're not willing to say that he actively did anything to ensure that any particular organism or even human beings were produced. So that's one way in which they've really yielded to a naturalistic understanding, even in their understanding of the evolutionary process. They're not willing to say that God is, for example, directing the mutations toward a particular outcome. They just say that undirected process is doing all the work. Somehow God is upholding it or sustaining it, but he's not involved in the process of creation in any discernible way.
And that kind of gets into the third section. Let me just explain for our listeners that the first section is the scientific critique of theistic evolution. We sort of camped out there today because, of course, we have Dr. Stephen Meyer here. But we also talked a little bit about that second section, the philosophical critique of theistic evolution. There's quite a bit in there as well. But the third one is the biblical and theological critique of theistic evolution, which I've sort of alluded to. I mentioned Wayne Grudem, but others have also pointed out how theistic evolution is incompatible with the teachings of the Old Testament. Theistic evolution is incompatible with the teachings of the New Testament, and theistic evolution is incompatible with historic Christian doctrine. Now, that's a little bit beyond what you have done necessarily in your section, but those are important issues as well. Before a Christian school or before a Christian university or before a pastor or whoever decides to simply embrace theistic evolution. And even though I've had individuals on this program that hold to theistic evolution who are prominent pastors or speakers, I still recognize that you've got some real major theological issues, don't you?
Well, right, and this is what the theological team was trying to highlight. I'm a Christian layperson. Not everyone who's a proponent of intelligent design is a Christian. Not all Darwin skeptics are Christians, but I do share concerns about the theological implications of this as well. Many of the theistic evolutionists, first of all, deny that God played an active role in creation, and I think that is not necessarily a form of deism, but it certainly diminishes. It's a diminished view of divine sovereignty and his involvement in the process of creation, which I think is incompatible with a straightforward reading of the biblical text. But secondly, many theistic evolutionists, in fact, most deny, because they read the Bible through an evolutionary lens, will deny that there's any historical import to the creation accounts, and therefore they deny that there was an original male and female from which all other humans came, no historical Adam, therefore no historical fall. Some will say that we fell up into consciousness, not down into sin, and it therefore becomes very difficult to reconcile. I think that position ends up rendering a doctrine like the atonement of Jesus Christ incoherent. If there was no fall, if there was no first Adam who fell, then what do we make of passages, for example, in St. Paul, who says that in Adam all fell and in Christ all were redeemed? There's no need for an atoning sacrifice if there was never any actual fall into sin from a state of moral innocence. So it sounds very innocuous on the front end. I just think that evolution is how God did it, or it's just the process by which God created. But that little statement conceals a wealth of difficulties, scientific, philosophical, and theological, and we try to unpack those in the book to give for this audience, a largely Christian audience, we're aiming this towards a chance to assess this issue for themselves in a way that maybe they haven't had the resources to do before.
Well, again, let me just mention also that people would want to connect up with you at the Discovery Institute. Just a while back, we had Jonathan Wells on. Years ago, we did an interview on his book on the icons of evolution. But, of course, he has this newest one out, in which it's called Zombie Science, in which these icons never really die, kind of like zombies. And
coming back, yeah.
They're coming back. So those, and by the way, Jonathan Wells has a chapter in here as well. And of course, he spends a fair amount of time showing how this thing looks like a hippopotamus, supposedly evolves into a whale, and saying, just look at all the things that have to happen, and we have no fossil record for it. So if you want to actually learn a great deal, let me point you towards the Discovery Institute, and in particular, the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. Steve Meyer, of course, is the director of that. And also to look at Illustria Media videos and a number of things. These are ways you can really educate your children, your grandchildren, but really educate yourself about these issues. And this is the newest book out. It is a book that is published by Crossway. You can find it in your local bookstore. Theistic Evolution, a Scientific, Philosophical, and Theological Critique. And Dr. Stephen Meyer, always great to have you on the program, and happy Thanksgiving.
You too, and great conversation, Kerby. Thanks so much for having me on.
We will take a break, and when we come back, going to bring Richard Green on for just a minute, because he has a video that is out, actually a film that I think you need to know about, and it has to do with the threat to our national security and also the plight of persecuted Christians. And then I'm going to have an open line. We can spend some time talking about some of the allegations of sexual misconduct. Oh, yes, there are many more shoes to drop this week and even in the last couple of days. And also maybe just try to answer some of the questions you might have about creation evolution. I saw some of those as kind of things that I can cover, and did not want to interrupt some of the conversation with Dr. Stephen Meyer. So if you'd like to know more about his book, you can go to the website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to know about Richard Green, who'll be with us for a little bit, Executive Director of the Clarion Project. We'll talk with him about this new film, Faith Keepers. And again, if you would like to know more about some of the issues we're discussing today, including my viewpoints on answering the new atheists, because they're the ones that are arguing for evolution, it's all at the website, pointofview.net. So take the time to visit pointofview.net. We'll take a break and come back with more right after this.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, the fully animated story of the first Christmas, told through a whole new set of eyes. Bo the donkey and his stable of animal friends follow the star to become some unlikely heroes.
That light, that's the star. This is where it's been leading me. What's his name?
His name is Jesus.
The Star, now playing. Rated PG, parental guidance suggested. More information is available at thestarmovie.com.
If you were homeless and on the run, all because you love Jesus, would you want Christians to step up and help? Our family in the Middle East, the cradle of our faith, is in desperate need because of ISIS and other persecutors. Point of View urges you to support the Cradle Fund today to help these precious believers. Please give at pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or write Cradle Fund in the memo of your check to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. Second hour today here during this Thanksgiving week. As I mentioned at the outset of the last hour, we are tomorrow going to focus a lot of time on Thanksgiving, America's godly heritage, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, and all the rest. So I think you will certainly appreciate that. But I wanted to put one more issue on the table, and then the last half hour, an open line for your comments and questions. We can get back to some of the conversation we had with Dr. Stephen Meyer. We can get into some of these allegations of sexual misconduct and a variety of other issues. But I wanted to tell you about a documentary that you need to know about. And if you've listened to Point of View, you know that so often I want to tell you about films that I think would be helpful. These could be films that you can see in your local theater, and we do feature those from time to time, or they're documentaries or other DVD projects or video projects that can be used to educate you and your family or your church. And certainly one area of concern that we've had for many years has been the issue of the rise of radical Islam and the plight of persecuted Christians. As a matter of fact, we've just finished raising money for the Cradle Fund, and we've raised money to encourage you to support groups like Samaritan's Purse, I should say, that spend time really ministering to the persecuted Christians. And we've had former Representative Frank Wolf on this program. As a matter of fact, I was just with him a week ago when we were going through together the Museum of the Bible. So we want to focus on this new film that you need to know about called Faith Keepers. I heard about this recently from someone here in Dallas and said it would be great if you could get Richard Green on the program to talk about this. So we have a link to their website, which is the Clarion Project. We have a link to the Faith Keepers video section, and we also have the trailer. And if you've listened to Point of View any length of time, you know that what I oftentimes encourage you to do is watch the trailer. It's about 2 minutes long, and then there's a arrow, and that's for the share button that you can click. And you can put it on your Facebook page or your Twitter page or send it by email to someone who would need to know about that. And so let's, if we can, talk about that for a few minutes. Richard Green is the executive director and co-founder of the Clarion Project. It is a nonprofit, a nonpartisan organization who's really working to try to educate all of us about various issues of national security, really focusing on the threat of radical Islam. And he joins us now by phone. Richard, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me.
Well, talk about what you have founded. For many, they may know the organization, but they may not. So as we click on that and visit your website, what will we find, and what are some of the various functions that are part of the Clarion Project?
So Clarion Project was founded in about 10 years ago, and we were founded as a result of making a film called Obsession: Radical Islam's War Against the West. The documentary was really a labor of a passion that myself and another founder, Phil Shore, had to educate the West about the true threat of radical Islam, not in an editorialized way, not in a fake way, not in a way in which we felt that any opinions had to be given, rather, or many opinions had to be given, rather in a way that just shows what's going on in the world. And we had decided to make that film because after 9/11, we were just shocked, surprised, astonished that Americans, the West in general, seemed to have a reaction to 9/11 that was perhaps predictable, but very disappointing. And that was that we said, why did they hate us? What and there was no education that was really effective as far as we saw it in giving the true narrative of what was going on in the radical Islamic world. So Obsession was really the first film that had brought to the West what the radical Muslims are saying in their own tongue,
Sure.
their own languages.
Yeah. Since we have such a terrible phone line from you, let's see if we can get a better one. But in the meantime, let me just mention that Faith Keepers is a film that really kind of addresses some of these issues. The title of it is Faith Keepers, Be Your Brother's Keeper. And really, if you think about it, right now in the Middle East, the birthplace of Christianity, you have Christians and other minorities, and whether it's Christians or Yazidis or Alawites or others, they're being persecuted and driven out and wiped out. And so this is something that we have been real concerned about. One of the reasons we were involved initially with the Cradle Fund was we recognized that many of them just escaped from Syria or Iraq, were in refugee camps. There was such a need for us to see if we could support them. And now we once again developed a little bit of a program to see if we could maybe support them so that now, after rescuing them, we could return them back to that area. So really, Faith Keepers kind of gives a face and a voice to this humanitarian crisis and genocide. So, Richard, what would you add to what people will find when they watch the film?
Well, we found that it was disappointing that there were many Americans who didn't realize the true plight of what was happening to Christianity and really the birth and the cradle of its existence. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to bring a film to light, bring the story to light of these of the genocide that was happening to the Christians of the Middle East, and that's what they'll see when they see the film. But they're not just going to see a daunting film that shows issues that seemingly are over there that they can't do anything about. I believe as a society, there's a lot of things that we can do to help the Christians in their plight, and I think that's always evolving. So hopefully this film will be the calling card for as many people to get educated as possible and therefore to take some action.
You know, one of the things I thought was so intriguing is when I looked at those people that endorsed the film, these are somewhat names that we've mentioned before, some who we've interviewed who are Muslims or are in some case continue to be Muslims. Of course, there are also former Muslims who become Christians. But it is, I think, telling that you have at least given some voice to some individuals who don't seem to make it onto the mainstream media. Rarely do we hear of an individual, a former Muslim who's become a Christian, or even some of the moderate Muslims. Those voices occasionally are heard on certain network programs, but not a whole lot. So here's a chance to hear some things that you don't hear if you turn on your television, correct?
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we try to do in the Clarion Project is to give voice to those people who don't have a voice. Now, that could be the Christians in the Middle East who are being slaughtered, but unfortunately, in our media, it seems that the organizations that have been given the platform, the Islamic organizations, the Muslim organizations, that have been given the greatest platform, such as CARE, Council for American Islamic Relations, MPAC, the Muslim PAC. Now, not all Muslims are bad, that's for sure. But the problem is that these are Muslim. The aforementioned groups are Muslim, have strong Muslim Brotherhood links, and those are the ones that the CNNs, even the Fox Newses of the world call so oftentimes. So when you're trying to understand and hear and look on the media, see a representative from the Muslim community, so oftentimes that representative is not representative of the larger Muslim community in America, at least. They're really Muslim Brotherhood, and they're giving, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to placate the audience and give them a false narrative.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue for just a few more minutes with Richard Green. If you'd like to join us, perhaps you have some comments or questions about Islam, terrorism, Sharia law, all that's fair game, and most importantly, about the plight of persecuted Christians. We'll be back right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Many of the best-selling books of the last decade have been written by the New Atheist. Although you may never meet any of these authors, you will certainly interact with skeptics who use their arguments. One of the best Christian books to help refute many of the arguments by these new atheists is the book Is God Just a Human Invention, written by Sean McDowell and Jonathan Morrow. They answer 18 of the most cited arguments used by the new atheists against religion and especially against Christianity. One of those arguments is found in the title of the book, that God is merely a human invention. Sigmund Freud wrote that religious beliefs are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind. In other words, we project the existence of God based upon a human need. It is wish fulfillment. We wish there would be a God, so we assume that he exists. As McDowell and Morrow point out in their book, there are many good reasons to reject this idea. One objection is that Freud's argument begs the question. In other words, he assumes there is no God and then merely tries to find an explanation for why someone would believe in God anyway. The projection theory can cut both ways. If you argue that humans created God out of a need for security, then you could just as easily argue that atheists believe there is no God because they want to be free and unencumbered by a creator who might make moral demands on them. It's not surprising to read how many prominent atheists in the past have acknowledged just that. They wanted their sexual freedom and found that required that they reject the idea of God. Paul teaches in the book of Romans that fallen individuals suppress the truth in unrighteousness. The Bible also has a good explanation for why most people believe in God. The writer of Ecclesiastes observes that God has set eternity in the hearts of men. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, The First Christmas Through a Whole New Set of Eyes. The Star, now playing rated PG, thestarmovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Richard Green with us for a few more minutes. If you'd like to ask us a question or make a comment about Islam, you can take this opportunity to do so. He will then move on after that, and then we'll have this open line in the last half hour to get into some of the issues that we've been discussing today. And Richard, my latest book, Understanding Islam and Terrorism, is really a revision of a book I wrote really 10 years ago, and I finally decided to rewrite it because I realized, words like ISIS aren't even in the old book, and there's so much that has happened. So now the largest chapter in this book is on, of course, terrorism, and some of those materials are new. The second largest chapter is on Sharia law, and I added that because there are more and more people that I run into are concerned that in this country we're really at least opening the door towards it. Now, nothing like you have in the UK, but at the same time, the Center for Security Policy and other individuals over the years and other organizations over the years have been able to find examples where sometimes Sharia law has sort of snuck into the American legal profession. What have you found in some of your research?
Listen, Sharia law is a incredibly complicated doctrine that is certainly the Muslim Brotherhood, who is the group, the most stealth group, certainly in America, but probably internationally, that tries to Islamify a society. They, in large part, try to do it by a creeping Sharia. Now, I think that there are many concerns with creeping Sharia. And one of the main things that we really have to do to combat it is to get the message out and the word out when we see it start to happen. And I just appreciate that you've written a whole chapter in your book about it because it's incredibly important subject matter.
Well, and again, it's something we need to pay attention to. And it's back to kind of why you put the organization together, because you really want to educate Americans about this idea of national security. And right now we have questions about should we have further vetting from people that come from these countries where there isn't maybe as much scrutiny and where Sharia law is taught, or where you are more likely to be radicalized. So is this at least some policy that you think might be implemented so that we can guarantee the security of Americans, and so that we will read about and hear about fewer of these look like jihadist attacks in America?
Well, I think it's a strong step forward. The issue is how do you do the vetting? Can it be effective vetting? And I have news for you. I think that the people who need to come to America as an regroupment of people, as a culture, as a society, and the ones that are under genocide are the Christians. And I'm a Jewish fellow saying that. It's not because I am a Christian. I'm just someone who cares deeply about all of humanity. And the issue is that the Christians are having a very, very hard time migrating to this country, even though there's a genocide happening, or that has happened. And the reason for that is very interesting. It's something that perhaps your listeners haven't heard, is when one gets kicked out of their home, right? And there is certainly in the Middle East, and they and they want to migrate to a safer area, so they have to go to camps. And in those camps, then from that point forward, the UN can decide if that person should indeed go to America, if they should migrate anywhere at all. The issue with the Christians is that those same as that camps are camps that are ISIS and Al Qaeda and radical Muslims have infiltrated, and there are so many people there that want to cause them harm that it's actually less safe for them to go to one of those camps than it is for them to stay outside of the camp. And as a result, they can't migrate to America. And that's one of the main reasons why we see the migration of Christians being so slow, almost non-existent. So in terms of, fighting for people, I'd prefer to fight for people, and I prefer to fight for the Christians who need to come here, and we need to open our borders up to the most.
Well
so
said.
That's where I would start.
Let's see if we can talk about this film again and the screening, because our listeners here can host a screening, and there are some different levels at which you can do that. First of all, if you want to host a screening for high school or college, those are free. Then there are certain amounts for those individuals that want to hold it. The film is about 50-plus minutes, and you can actually download a high-resolution copy of the film. You can show it and use that in various venues. But Richard, go through what you want to achieve through the screenings that are taking place right now, and how people can get involved with you so that they can educate themselves and the people in their sphere of influence.
Yeah, well, I'd like as many people to screen the film as possible, to as many of their friends as possible. We know that not everyone can become an expert on radical Islam. But there's a lot of people in the plight of the Christians in the Middle East. At the same time, so what we've done is we've created a tool, a resource for everyone to use, everyone who has a heart to use. And what we're trying to do is get as many home screenings, as many church screenings, and as many just as many people watch this film as possible. So number one is I would go to our Faith Keepers website. And if you type in Google Faith Keepers and put Clarion Project, you'll go to you can navigate to host a screening page, and you can host a screening. It's very economically, it should not be a challenge. And if it was, you can always write us an email. Really, we want to get the word out much more. That's the reason we made the film. So I would certainly like people to do that as well. We have on our website a button that says Help Now. And when one clicks on that button, they will see that we have the 3 A's: advocacy, awareness, and aid. And what we've found in making this movie is that, sure, Christians in the Middle East, they need aid. People who've been houses have been destroyed, families have been the families that were nuclear families before are the husband perhaps is no longer living, so on and so forth. They need aid. But as well to aid, we have to garner awareness, and we have to have advocacy. You see, most of the people who have gone through these atrocities have decided that they want to get the word out, and that is really what is the paramount concern of their life. They don't want their loved ones lost to go in vain. So the way we do this is we have this advocacy, awareness, and aid, and we've chosen, and one can donate to any of those three things through the Faith Keepers Fund. Again, it's called the Faith Keepers Fund, and it's on the Faith Keepers website. And through donating to that, we will make sure that the organizations that we have vetted to give aid, the right organizations will get the money, and then the surplus of money would go towards the advocacy and awareness.
And again, that is available on our website. We have links to Faith Keepers and ClarionProject.org and all the rest. Advocacy, awareness, and aid. One of the questions I oftentimes get when we talk about films is what is the appropriate age? And again, if you go to the section on the film, it answers all of those questions. But on the screenings page, which is the third one down, it says, well, this is pretty much high school. So anybody 14 years of age and older. If indeed you want to show this to a large group, there's a fee. But again, it asks, well, could you actually charge entrance to the screening? Of course, you could do that. There are all sorts of questions that people have about what you receive in the screening kit, whether the subtitles are available. Of course, I've already mentioned how long it is, 51 minutes. And so a lot of the questions you might have about the screening are on the web page there and the screenings page. And again, this is something that I would encourage you to find out more about, because if nothing else, it's very well produced. You can watch, of course, the trailer. Roma Downey, who we've talked with before on this program, executive producer, a variety of other individuals that you can read about there as well. And so we wanted to educate you, as we always do, about some of these films coming out, and encourage you to educate yourself and people in your sphere of influence by having a screening. So, Richard, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, and thank you for listeners for hopefully going ahead and screening the film to as many people as you possibly can. Get this very important subject matter more well known.
Well, again, let's take a break. Last half hour, open line. I've got some issues to address, certainly in light of all the issues in the news. We've just, again, have all sorts of individuals that, in particular, Charlie Rose fired after allegations of sexual misconduct. We have a member of Congress get into some of those issues. So if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Just an opportunity for you to join us today, and we'll come back to some of the other questions we dealt with on terms of everything from creation, evolution, theistic evolution, intelligent design, some of these allegations, and, of course, even this issue of Islam. So let's open up the phones, give you a chance to join our conversation today on this Thanksgiving week. 1-800-351-1212. Otherwise, sit back. We have a lot to talk about, and I know you'd probably like to join us in that conversation. We'll be right back.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour open line if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some of your phone calls in just a minute. Let's get back to some of these allegations. You know, when the story about Harvey Weinstein broke, I, at the time, said, I wonder if this will be maybe the breaking of the dam, if for no other reason than someone that powerful with that amount of influence was brought forward. Now, this isn't the first time. As a matter of fact, our second article we've posted has to do with Bill Clinton and sexual allegations. That's an article written by Ed Klein, who was on the show with us recently, and we can remember that. Of course, that has changed dramatically as well. There was a very good article that came out recently that just simply said, you know, we were young, but you know, now there are a lot of people that are saying we made a real mistake when we did not deal with the issue of how to address the sexual allegations of misconduct by the president at that point, Bill Clinton. And I would argue, and maybe you would agree or disagree, that maybe that was also something that unleashed a lot more of this. If the president of the United States can get away with various allegations that came from Juanita Broderick and a variety of others. I've focused primarily on hers, but you can go to Paula Hill and, of course, also be involved as an individual who was much older than Monica Lewinsky and using, if you will, his power and influence in that regard. If he can get away with this, then anybody can get away with it, so it's quite possible that opened the door. Well, what now has opened the door for these allegations have made it safe for women who for many years have been silent. We've talked about whether they should have been silent because their silence might have allowed other women to be exploited as well. But the next couple of shoes to drop, of course, we mentioned last week Al Franken, but the one that I think shocked a few people in the broadcast world was Charlie Rose. And CBS fired Charlie Rose after 8 women accused the veteran journalist of sexual misconduct. The head of the CBS, the president, David Rhodes, in a memo said, despite Charlie's important journalistic contribution to our news division, there is absolutely nothing more important in this or any organization than ensuring a safe professional workplace, a supportive environment where people feel they can do their best work. He went on to add, we needed to be such a place. I'm deeply disappointed and angry that people were victimized and that even people not connected with these events could see their hard work undermined. So a lot of this comes from a report that appeared in the Washington Post. And the reaction was pretty quick because Charlie Rose hosts CBS's This Morning. And, of course, a lot of this centers around Charlie Rose's PBS program, which actually goes all the way back to the late 1990s. So there's somebody in broadcast. Now, can I be a little bit skeptical and say that when I hear people today, like at MSNBC is a good example, that are just lamenting and crying about this and horrified, and then making the statement in front of the camera that they knew nothing about it? Really? Journalists knew nothing about that. You heard no reports. You heard no gossip. You heard nothing that suggested that any one of these 8 women, and these are just the ones that came forward. You've got to believe there's some others that simply said, well, if they're going to come forward, I don't need to add my name to the list. And so that is certainly hard for me to understand. Then going back to Congress, we've looked at, of course, Al Franken in the United States Senate. Also, of course, we can see what was happening in the court case with Senator Menendez. But here we have one in the House of Representatives, and that is Senate Democrats in the House Judiciary Committee are calling for an ethics probe of Representative John Conyers of Michigan after a report revealed that staffers had accused him of sexual harassment. There's the idea that maybe he paid them off. But you have Representatives Jerry Nadler, who is a Democrat from New York, and Zoe Lofgren, a Democrat from California, who are the second and third most senior Democrats on the powerful committee, respectively, said that today, I should say, the House Ethics Committee should investigate the validity of the BuzzFeed news report that was published last night. Some of the comments that came from Lofgren, the reports about Congressman Conyers are as serious as they get. The Committee on Ethics should take up the matter immediately with a goal of promptly assessing the validity of the news account. This reported behavior cannot be tolerated in the House of Representatives or anywhere else. And, of course, I mentioned Representative Nadler issued a statement in which he said, again, that the allegations against Conyers are extremely serious and deeply troubling. Obviously, these allegations must be investigated promptly by the Ethics Committee. He said there can be no tolerance for behavior that subjects women to the kind of conduct alleged. So those are just a few of many others. The list is growing day by day. And again, this is not exactly what some leaders in the Democratic Party wanted. They wanted to focus attention on some of the misbehavior of Donald Trump long ago before he became president. Wanted to also focus on the alleged misbehavior of Roy Moore. And I'll say alleged for that one. Donald Trump had owned his, but Roy Moore to this day says no, some of these allegations, if not all of these allegations, are false. And that is a decision that those voters in Alabama will have to consider as well, whether or not they will vote for Roy Moore, whether they vote for Doug Jones, or whether they won't vote. And that is an issue as well. How do we think about this from a Christian point of view? We've posted a couple of articles. I posted one by Marvin Olasky last week. I posted another one today. Marvin Olasky is the editor of the World Magazine, and he calls it Beyond Politics, Evaluating Accusations of Sexual Misconduct. And he said the past 2 days have brought more Roy Moore accusers, but the big news in the news front is the sexual predator wars. Washington with accusations against Senator Al Franken from Minnesota that contain photographic evidence. This development shows how the current cultural moment can be a positive one for a biblical sexual ethic if we don't let short-term considerations overwhelm our theology. And here's where he's going to get to the point. He says in the second paragraph, 2,000 years ago, the New Testament displayed a pro-woman outlook. In opposition to Rome's condescension to women as property, the Gospels and the book of Acts show them, like men, as made in God's image and worthy of respect. Women followed Jesus, witnessed the empty tomb, and were central to the formation of early churches. The Apostle Paul told men to love and defend their wives and not treat them as sexual playthings or kitchen help, but could be dismissed for burning dinner. And he says, over the past week, the spotlight on sexual predators moved from Hollywood to New York to Alabama, but that's a temporary stopping point on the road to Washington. He says, I've only spent a not-so-grand total of about 3 years in the District of Columbia, but even I have heard of the sexual harassment and more young women face there. It's important for evangelicals not to defend unbiblical treatment of women, but to expose and to reduce it. He goes on to say, we can't do this in every instance we calculate, whether it will work to our immediate political detriment. He reminds us that feminists such as Gloria Steinem did this regarding President Clinton back in 1998. She acknowledged in a New York Times column, which came out on March 22nd of 1998, that President Clinton may be a candidate for sexual addiction therapy, but feminists will still have been right to resist pressure by the right wing and the media to call for his resignation or impeachment. Steinem said that the Monica Lewinsky affair really does not count, despite Lewinsky's age and the power differential, because she welcomed the attention. Regarding Clinton's attack on Kathleen Willey, Steinem said he made a gross, dumb, and reckless pass at a supporter during the low point in her life. She pushed him away and said, I'll never have it again. In other words, President Clinton took a no for an answer. Of course, she's, ignoring some of the others, like some of the others. But nevertheless, that's the case. Then he goes on to say that if nothing else, now we're seeing a change. And I've posted some articles about that because, as he points out, a liberal social critic actually wrote earlier in The Atlantic that the Democratic Party needs to make its own reckoning of the way it protected Bill Clinton. The party needs to come to terms with the fact that it was so enraptured by their brilliant big dog president and his stunning string of progressive accomplishments that it abandoned some of its central principles. Let's hope that happens. I've got my doubts, but we will see. But whether we're talking about Roy Moore, evangelicals, and of course we posted a piece by a very well-written piece, I might say, by Marvin Olasky last week called Roy Moore and Evangelicals. This one just again says, let's not make the mistake that some of the feminists had of saying, well, we're going to turn a blind eye to some of these issues. Instead, what we want to do is apply a biblical principle. And I've said, I guess, on this program, and I'm still disturbed by it, that there was an editorial, an op-ed piece, I guess, that appeared in Christianity Today by one individual that seemed a little bit critical of the vice president, Mike Pence, who has said, I really try to avoid at all costs having a private lunch meeting with a woman, and saying this is just all for show. But I'm thinking, just ask yourself this question. If you have a teenage daughter, would you rather they spend time around a person like Mike Pence, or around a person like Al Franken, or maybe John Conyers, or Charlie Rose, or Harvey Weinstein? I think I know the answer to that question. Maybe you do as well. Let's take a break. I'll take some phone calls, though. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A recent article out of Canada reports that ethicists are recommending that conscience laws be modified for the medical profession. The argument suggests that physicians should not have the right to opt out of providing such services as prescribing contraceptives when a patient requests such services. According to the authors, quote, doctors must put patients' interest ahead of their own integrity. If this leads to feelings of guilt or remorse or them dropping out of the profession, so be it, unquote. That is truly shocking language that we should take note of, especially since, as the article in the National Post points out, every country in the civilized world recognizes at least some form of conscientious objection. Not only do the authors suggest that certain professions should be closed to those whose integrity would require the abandonment of the conscience to practice it, it fails to understand what conscience actually is. The reason we provide protections for the exercise of conscience is because people should not be made by the government to make their conscience optional. As Dr. Robert George of Princeton University has put it, quote, the right of conscience is a right to do what one judges oneself to be under an obligation to do, unquote. We will see whether Canada takes up the proposal by its professors, but south of the border, we must be vigilant that we never permit the government to make optional what our Creator has made obligatory. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Let's take a phone call or two. We certainly will try to get in as many as we can here. Let's, if we can, pick up a call from David in California. David, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, how are you, Kerby? I had made a point to call in this hour, and did you already go through your guest who's in the second hour regarding security issues?
I did, but I would be glad to take your phone call on whatever you would like to address.
Well, I'd tie it to what you were just talking about, whether it's sexual peccadillos or his whole discussion of security. The blackmail used to be a big issue.
Yeah, I think it is. Yes.
Yeah, regarding security and sexual predilections was always a big issue, and in fact, as I read more about the Joseph McCarthy days, apparently homosexuality was not that big of an issue in World War II, or even earlier than that, the Civil War. As a matter of fact, it was not that big of an issue. But after Joe McCarthy and Roy Cohn got going, they really brought it to the fore, and being gay was a blackmailable issue. And so the idea of lifting that veil removed the problem of blackmail. And now the issue of whether or not someone's been, whether an adulterer or having problems with keeping their hands to themselves, as we see with some of these other incidents, that's getting back into blackmail. And so whether we, the people, have control of our government when you've got people who can't keep their hands to themselves really gets into whether or not the nation can get honest government. And it's getting to be pretty disturbing when, if I look at Al Franken and who's the congressman from Michigan?
You're talking about Conyers, John Conyers?
Yeah, Conyers.
Just a few.
Conyers and Al Franken are both very strong in the opposition to Trump. They've both been working seriously on the on the Russian investigation. So I don't really have too much doubt that the allegations are coming from Trump as that goes. But as it goes to the issue of Roy Moore, he was a prosecutor down in Alabama when these incidents about the 14-year-old girl and the teenagers and whatnot came in. And so whether or not he was basically abusing his office as a prosecutor and keeping people silent because he would be able to, if, say, for example, a girl was out after 9 o'clock at night, in Alabama in the 70s, that was still a big issue back then where, bad girls could get blackmailed. And whether or not he was going out of his way to, take girls who had been arrested for being out late or something like that, and then he would abuse his position as a DA to drop the charges if they were accommodating. And so the idea of a dirty district attorney is of serious discussion in all of this. Dirty politicians who abuse their office for sexual favors. It's as old as the hills, probably all the way back to Pharaoh's day, but in a democracy where we're supposed to have taxation with representation,
yes,
the idea of
and accountability and ethics probes. Let me jump in real quickly because we're almost out of time, and I want to pick up a couple of things because I want to validate some of the things you said and maybe drive a couple other discussions. And one of those is it possible that some individuals are being blackmailed? Well, even before the Harvey Weinstein thing, I had somebody who's been around Washington, D.C. said, I've been hearing lately that there are a fair number of members of Congress that could be easily blackmailed if they aren't being already because they've been paying out. And, of course, now we found out, if you go to my articles last week, I think it was $17 million is paid out for some of these harassment cases, which, first of all, think about this. They're using our tax dollars to pay off women that have been abused in one way or another, or groped, or at least flirted with, or whatever it was. They're using our tax dollars to pay them off instead of the individuals that actually committed those, if you will, ethical breaches, in some cases crimes. So that's enough that should make you angry enough. Well, I heard that before. Now I've heard from some members of Congress that said, you would not be surprised if you were to find out there are some of these cases going on. So the blackmail issue that you've talked about apparently is in Congress. The other question you raised about Roy Moore is a good one. When this first broke, remember Dr. Merrill Matthews is in studio, and he was saying, the only question I have about this is why now? If indeed a person is a sexual predator, usually this happens over a period of time. And, these originally were 40 years ago, and we haven't heard anything since. Okay, now maybe you have a possible answer. First of all, we had one that happened in 1991, one of the individuals coming forward. But you're right. The issue of power is an issue. And, of course, that comes back to one of the articles I would encourage you to read, since we're going to run out of time before we get into all these discussions. And that is the piece by Ed Klein, who's talking about the fact that now former President Bill Clinton is facing all sorts of new charges of sexual assault. Some of these allegations against him go back to times when he was in office, but now the newest charges stem from the period after he left the White House in 2001. So this is another issue that is going to have to surface as well, and maybe is an illustration for why you've had some people coming forward for the first time and saying, maybe we did not respond appropriately. And since we're running out of time, let me just end with this particular op-ed column by Michelle Goldberg, writing in the New York Times. This is from a week ago. She said, of the Clinton accusers, the one who haunts me is Juanita Broderick. The story she tells about Clinton recalls those we've heard about Harvey Weinstein. She claimed that they had plans to meet in a hotel coffee shop, but the last minute he asked to have her come up to the hotel room where he raped her. 5 witnesses said she confided to them about the assault right after it happened. It's true that she denied the rape in an affidavit to Paula Jones' lawyers before changing her story when talking to federal investigators, but her explanation was she didn't want to go public, but she couldn't lie to the FBI. That makes sense to me. And so Michelle Goldberg ends this by saying, put simply, I believe her. Well, since we now have some more of these allegations against Bill Clinton after he left the White House in 2001, now you have that, of course, flying, as we've talked about before, on a jet that was called Air Blank One. I won't even say the letter, but you can probably guess what it was, and all the other actions that are taking place. This is really significant. So, again, I might point you to some of the articles we've posted by Jim Garrity, Kevin Williamson, this one today by Ed Klein and others. And I think David is right on target. There was the possibility for blackmail, but now as these are coming forward, maybe they won't be blackmailed, but I think we might find out that there was a lot more hanky-panky going on than we would have ever imagined. We heard about the possibility of having a casting couch in Hollywood. We suspected it happened in New York and in Washington, D.C., and we're finding out it was happening in a lot of places. So wish we had more time. We'll cover maybe some of that tomorrow, but we also on Thanksgiving week wanted to focus on some of the things we can learn about America's godly heritage and the Pilgrims and the Puritans. So we will do that tomorrow. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. Visit our website, pointofview.net. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
You're riding down the road, and just ahead you see an elderly woman tumble off the curb into the street. As your friend drives past, she prays, "Lord, please send someone to help that poor woman," and drives